Simple question for you. We're going to talk to Matt Lowry shortly. More sets of lights are going into Auckland, you may have noticed.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
These are said to be economically stifling. New research from the UK's Institute of Economic Affairs. 4 in every 5 sets of traffic lights, it reckons, should be removed. Traffic lights and speed bumps are damaging the economy. A 2-minute delay with every car journey costs the UK economy £16 billion a year. Nor are they good for us environmentally with increased fuel consumption, emissions and so on.
I can just imagine if you ripped out, 4 out of every 5 traffic lights within the next 5 years, I suspect you'd have replaced half of them, given people would be dying in accidents at those very intersections. That, I think, is a pretty major issue why, at busy intersections you have lights.
Yeah, but there was and it's a different place and it's a different mentality, but there was a place in Holland that the city removed all the light. I don't know where it is.
Yes, you hear about these experiments.
Yeah, and it's fine. It's gone absolutely fine. And it's interesting what would happen. I mean, once you try and it's carnage, but at the top of our reasonably busy road, the lights went out. And you know what happened? Everybody worked it out.
Yeah, and that's the argument made by this think tank in the UK, that people do work it out and shared spaces are nice. But as Matt says, how does that work writ large? When you're trying to get somewhere in a hurry at higher speeds.
And when it's on a big scale of a big city too. I mean,
if you say if the lights turn off, people just work it out. Well, the lights have gone out in Auckland occasionally and it's massive gridlock. That no one's worked it out. People are working it out on their horns.
Oh, no, I don't know that that's happened. I know that there's been accidents that have caused gridlock and things being damaged, but I don't know if lights have ever caused gridlock.
I'll tell you who will know, and that is Matt Lowry from the Transport blog, who is joining us now.
Controversy.
Matt, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Jim.
Actually, in answer to that question first, do people work it out? What do you reckon as about shared spaces and people working it out as an alternative to a whole lot of traffic lights?
They can be really positive. So we know in Auckland our shared spaces have been really popular, and that's exactly what's happened. But there's also, you have to balance them and have them in the right place. You're not going to have a shared space on the intersection coming off a motorway, for example. So it's really a balance and getting that balance right. And and lights in some places work fine, roundabouts in some places work fine, and in other places, perhaps just leaving it to people with a shared space type situation would also be fine.
All right. The main reason we got you on was to ask you about this so-called claimed economic benefit from not having cars idle for 2 minutes at traffic lights, and the claimed economic benefit that accrues when you spend all the money you need to spend on smarter traffic lights in order for this to happen. You've probably done a bit of reading on this too.
Well, there's actually a bigger picture as well. As it's not always just about the traffic that traffic lights are for. And so, for example, pedestrians and getting that. So, there's a lot of places where if you pull traffic lights out, people just wouldn't be able to cross the road, and then that forces you to drive more, which can cause more congestion. So there's a lot of aspects that perhaps I think the study's overlooked. It's all very well just saying we can all drive faster, but that's not what everyone's doing. And it might also make it very difficult, for example, to get out of a side street that has very low volumes, and that's one of the reasons why roundabouts aren't used sometimes, because if you're on a small side street with the most of the flow coming from one other direction, you're not going to get out. So it's really a horses for courses approach.
Speaking of side streets, a listener named Ross did send what seemed to be an unassailable sort of example, which we all recognise. You're on a busy road like Great North in Auckland. Someone drives out of the side street going down to the zoo, a new set of lights in there, actually, in the last year. And that's fair enough. That person has to be able to move, Matt. But then that person's car is allowed to disappear into the middle distance before the lights change for all the other cars, which seems to be a dumb use of traffic lights. In other words, they could be sped up. That could be improved a lot. And that happens all over New Zealand. Example of that.
It's absolutely is a horses for courses approach, and so some places that's the case, and perhaps it might be that the traffic lights are sped up, or they made to cycle faster. That can have other implications as well for safety if people are racing when they shouldn't be, and all sorts of things. So I think that it's probably a case where there's some traffic lights you could pull out, and you probably could be absolutely fine, and we could have some gains from it. But it's really very site specific, and that's one of the problems.
So, do they need more people watching all those screens in Takapuna? Would that solve that?
Well, I don't necessarily need people watching it, but they need systems in place that they can see where the flows are and where how many people are there and waiting and getting that balance right.
Those systems are there, but obviously they're concentrating on the motorways, are they?
No, they concentrate on local routes too. There's been a lot of work in the last 3 to 4 years on optimising routes. So I know, for example, if I'm driving home along Lincoln Road out West Auckland, often the lights are synchronised so that it's sort of a green way where you travel down, and that's the main flow. So it depends on the time of day you go and what route you're taking and all that sort of thing. But they have done a lot of work to help streamline them a bit more, so they're not just each one doing its own thing, that they're actually working together in unison a bit more.
All right, thank you, Matt. That's good. Matt Lowry on the panel at 2 minutes to 5. Any concluding comments on that topic from either?
No, so I always was under the impression that at least some traffic lights had a sensor underneath when you drove
Yeah,
up.
they do have sensors.
They have an induction coil, so a large metal object like
But
a car will
I
trigger.
suppose it can't say how many cars are behind you. Is that? I guess that's the thing.
Well, unless you're looking at that camera at Smales Beach and Takapuna, you can't necessarily see all the cars that are that are lined up. But behind the right turning intersection, you're only letting 5 cars through.
I mean, is there a more frustrating thing in this world and be sitting there at a red light with nothing else for miles? You're sitting there for what seems like an age, and you're the only one at an intersection. It drives me nuts. Drives me crazy.
Right, so you are concerned by it.
Yeah, I mean that's my own little personal thing, but yeah, if you can make it more efficient, however that happens, of course.
Someone says, we started off with shared spaces and no traffic lights, and they were added after the event. Good point. If motorists learnt to drive carefully and considerately, perhaps we could go back to shared spaces and no traffic lights, says Annie.
And you wonder about, what's the efficiency of having a pointsman rather than but it used to be all the, you look at American cities and having a cop out there going visually, right? I don't know how manpower-wise it's probably completely impractical.
It's completely impractical. I mean,
Okay, thanks, Matt.
So you need 3 shifts to do it 24 hours a day.
Yeah, okay.
And then
all right, shoot my
what
idea
happens during
down.
breaks?
Okay.
Or just road rage. Imagine that. Someone just completely flipping it, saying, you piss off the traffic guy and he just leaves you there forever.
But an obvious source of employment in places like Singapore is when they do hire people to do exactly that kind of looking after pedestrians and traffic.
I remember being very impressed by Singapore's traffic lights. They were one of the first countries that synchronised their emergency services with the traffic lights. So their ambulances would always get green and their fire trucks would always get green. It was an amazing use of technology.
Now that's efficiency there, mate.
Now I reckon we should auction that off to rich people. We could fund all the roads we want.
Rich people get to go. Nice.
Matt Nippert.
The green card, we can call it.
Matt Nippert has been on the panel today with Andrew Clay. Lovely to see both of you again.
Pleasure, Jim.
Thanks, everybody. We're back tomorrow, and Checkpoint with John Campbell follows.
Kia ora everyone, welcome to Checkpoint with John Campbell on RNZ National. We're on the radio, of course. We're screening live on Freeview Channel 50 and we are streaming live on radionz.co.nz/checkpoint. However you're doing so, thank you for joining us. Tonight, those cattle beasts have been in the water for years. A neighbour of the station at Lake Taylor tells us, and he's previously complained to ECAN. The government overcomes its own earlier scepticism and buys into Auckland's City Rail Link. A man who committed a series of rapes in Hamilton in 2007 found. The detective in charge joins us to explain. And suffrage becomes more universal, one young voter at a time. But first, here's Katrina Batten with RNZ News.
Kia ora, good evening. The Prime Minister is leaving the door open to Auckland Council levying road taxes or imposing tolls to pay its share of the City Rail Link. John Key says, however, there would have to be a strong justification for any such measures before the government agrees to a final deal. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
In his first major speech of the year, Mr Key confirmed government funding for the $2.5 billion project to allow major work to start earlier. He says, however, a contract still has to be negotiated, including details about how the rail link will be owned and managed. But Mr Key says, in principle, the government's willing to pay half the cost. He says the council has to consider how it will raise its share, with options including borrowing, privatisation and potentially taxes or tolls. The Auckland Mayor Len Brown says road taxes or tolls are options the council is still committed to and wants to keep on the table. In Auckland, Jane Patterson.
A Canterbury holiday home owner says he's been complaining for 15 years about cattle owned by the Chief Justice and her husband having access to lakes in the high country. Dame Sian Elias and businessman Hugh Fletcher are being investigated by the Canterbury Regional Council after cattle they own were photographed standing in a lake. Edward Snowden, who has a batch on Lake Loch Katrine, says he's made numerous complaints to the council and the Department of Conservation, but nothing has ever been done.
So usually the answer is, we've phoned up the manager of Lake Station and he says, oh yes, the cows must have escaped around the gate, around the fence, and they've gone in there by themselves. Yes, I'll take them out.
Edward Snowden says cattle are deliberately put in areas of the lake where they shouldn't be. The police say the victims of a serial rapist in Hamilton in 2007 no longer need to fear him with the closing of the case. DNA matching has confirmed that a Perth man living in Hamilton at the time 3 women were attacked was responsible. The man, who hasn't been named, died in July 2013 and his DNA was provided by the police in Western Australia. He'd come to their attention over a minor non-sexual offence. Detective Inspector Chris Page says while there is a sense of unfinished business by not being able to hold the man to account for the crimes, it's good to be able to close the case.
For me to be able to tell you today, and more importantly tell the people of Hamilton, and at an even higher level to speak to the victims and let them know that A, we've identified him, and B, where he is now, that he can no longer hold fear over the people of this town or these victims, is a really good place to be.
Chris Page says the man's family is distraught about what he did. Emergency services have rushed to an accident on the west coast where a van thought to be carrying 7 people has crashed. The police say the van crashed 10 kilometres south of Charleston on State Highway 6, about 30 kilometres south of Westport. 2 rescue helicopters from Nelson and Greymouth, along with 2 ambulances, have been treating the injured and 2 people have been transferred to hospital. The journalist Nicky Hager says the police will not be appealing against his High Court victory late last year. His home was searched in 2014 amid an investigation to identify sources who contributed to his book Dirty Politics. But the High Court ruled that the warrant used was fundamentally unlawful because officers failed to disclose key information to the judge who sanctioned the search. Nicky Hager's legal team says the author is now entitled to get his belongings back. These include computer equipment and documents that have been held sealed at the High Court in Auckland for more than a year. New Zealand has slipped again, this time to 4th place in the global anti-corruption rankings released this afternoon. Transparency International, which collates the rankings, warns this country will fall further if public access to information and environmental protections don't keep pace with those of Northern Europe. New Zealand topped the rankings of 168 countries as recently as 2013, and 7 times in total, but it's been overtaken by Scandinavian countries. Transparency International says the government must act immediately to restore the country's reputation or suffer huge disadvantages as companies will be put off doing business here. Whanganui iwi say human remains returned to the tribe have been treated with dignity and buried in a traditional ceremony. The Whanganui Regional Museum has given the iwi about 70 remains or koiwi, some of which had been in storage for more than 100 years. The museum says they were mostly Māori remains and had been collected from sand dunes, archaeological sites, and some were taken from graves. A local iwi leader, Jared Albert, is unhappy that the koiwi was stored away for so long. In sport, heavy rain has forced both the New Zealand and Pakistan men's cricket teams to train indoors today, ahead of tomorrow's second one-day international in Napier. And the record fast bowler Doug Bracewell has given his opinion of the treatment dished out by the crowd in Wellington to the convicted spot fixer Mohammad Amir. The Pakistani paceman was taunted over his past at the Basin Reserve, with a fan reportedly waving money at Amir. Bracewell's been on the end of some spectators sledging himself.
You've got to expect that you're going to get a bit of grief on the boundary at times, especially touring. It's never easy, you always cop a little bit from the spectators. It's never really witty or smart. Doug
Bracewell's been brought into the Black Caps in place of the injured Mitchell McClenaghan. There's been a big upset in the women's quarter-finals at the Australian Tennis Open. German 7th seed Angelique Kerber's knocked out the two-time champion Victoria Azarenka. Kerber now plays Britain's Joanna Konta, who's just beaten Chinese qualifier Shui Zhong, also in straight sets. Meanwhile, the four governing bodies of world tennis have agreed to review their anti-corruption program in light of recent allegations of match fixing. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, David Barber talks about whizzing all over the place. 60 years as a foreign correspondent. Ala Olban returns home to Pripyat, abandoned almost 30 years ago after the Chernobyl atomic power station meltdown. She also meets some of the children of that disaster. And Will Flockton celebrates the space walk of Tim Peake, Brighton's first astronaut. I wonder if he can see the pier from up there. Join me, Brian Crump, from Afternoon News at 7 on RNZ National.
Met service weather now to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Kapiti, including central high country and the Bay of Plenty. Showers mainly afternoon and evening, some heavy with thunderstorms and possible torrential downpours about the central high country, the south of Waikato to the north of Taranaki and Northland this afternoon. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, showers today, rain with heavy falls tomorrow, easing to a few showers in the afternoon. Wellington and southern Wairarapa, low cloud and patchy drizzle or rain, gradually clearing tomorrow. Nelson and Marlborough, excluding the Kaikoura coast, occasional rain, clearing Thursday morning. Buller and Westland, rain easing to isolated showers tomorrow morning and becoming confined to the ranges in the afternoon. Canterbury and Kaikoura coast, rain easing to patchy drizzle late tomorrow morning. Otago and Southland, patchy drizzle, mainly near the coast, however fine breaks inland tomorrow afternoon. Fiordland, cloudy periods and the Chatham Islands, low cloud, rain developing early tomorrow. It's 5:08.
Lovely to have you with us, everyone. Thank you, Katrina. The government has ended 5 years of haggling and committed itself to Auckland's underground rail project, the country's largest ever transport project. Initially greeted with loud scepticism, particularly from former Transport Minister Stephen Joyce, the City Rail Link opens up the western end of Britomart, allowing more trains in and out of the central city station and providing a more direct central city link to the line heading to the city's west. It will also see the creation of 2 new stops in the CBD. The Prime Minister has confirmed the government will pick up around half of the $2.5 billion cost of the link, which will be built over the next 7 years. But the Auckland Council and the government are still discussing whether drivers should pay motorway charges to help fund it. We're going to discuss this with our political editor, Jane Patterson, in about an hour. The government now not ruling out road tolls or something similar. This is interesting. Coming up also, reaction from Patrick Reynolds of Transport Blog. They're big supporters of this. What do they think about today's announcement? But first, our Auckland correspondent Todd Niall filed this report.
Today's announcement removes previous government conditions on funding and a possible 2-year pause in building the City Rail Link. It gives the Auckland Council the certainty it needs to start major tunnelling under the CBD in 2018, as soon as it finishes the initial stages already underway. The Prime Minister John Key says the government's been swayed by rising rail patronage and more than $1 billion of commercial property developments poised to be built along the downtown route.
What this is really about is about competitiveness of Auckland. So one of the issues is if you get traffic gridlock, if you get consumers not being able to move around, and also if you don't get certainty for some of these big groups. That's what they really want. They want certainty to know they can invest their billions of dollars, which they're going to invest based off this central rail link, that we just need to tell them that that's happening.
The Mayor, Len Brown, made the project his top election pledge in 2010. He says he was always confident this day would come.
My view was that at some point the people of Auckland would speak for themselves, vote with their feet, get on the trains, and they would persuade the government with their actions, and that's what they've done.
Both the Mayor and the Prime Minister expect the cost to be split almost 50-50. But they disagree over the Council's hopes to raise transport funds by charging drivers to use the city's motorways. John Key is lukewarm on the idea.
It reduces the available disposable income of Aucklanders and makes us Auckland as a place to do business a little more expensive. We haven't ruled those things out, but we have said that they would absolutely need to justify them.
Len Brown is unmoved.
The motorway network charge is one of the possibilities, And that discussion will carry on. Some of the advice that you might hear from the likes of Treasury could be that this is an efficient way of actually funding transportation networks.
Mr Key also gave the green light to the so-called East-West Link, a mainly freight highway between Onehunga and Mount Wellington, which links the southern and southwestern motorways. It's been granted roads of national significance status, fast-tracking the planning and consent stages, with construction to start in 2 to 3 years' time. In today's audience was Matt Lowry, an editor from the Transport blog website and a long-time supporter of the City Rail Link.
It's good that we're starting to see more city-shaped thinking occurring around, Auckland is different from the rest of the country, and that there is some positives to that. But it just means different things, so it's good that we're hearing some of those comments from Key.
Kim Campbell, the Chief Executive of the Employers and Manufacturers Association, thinks popular support in Auckland for the City Rail Link has finally persuaded the government to get on board.
What was obvious to everybody else has now become, I think, frankly, a vote-costing thing for the government. They've realised that the people of Auckland have had enough of procrastination. They want to see things happening.
A point not lost on the Prime Minister.
The Central Rail Link is going ahead. I think Aucklanders will judge us on our record across a wide range of areas, but if it comes to a judgment of how successful we've been as an infrastructure government, I suspect we'll get a pretty big tick.
4 smaller but locally important projects elsewhere in the country have also been brought forward. In Taranaki, the Mount Messenger and Awakino tunnel bypasses, replacing the Motu Bridge on the East Cape and replacing a bridge at Opawa near Blenheim. In Auckland for Checkpoint, Todd Nile.
Thanks, Todd. We're going to discuss the politics of this with political editor Jane Patterson after the 6 o'clock news. The government and campaigners for better public transport in Auckland have often been at loggerheads, but today, seemingly, a change. Kim Baker-Wilson with this report.
Right, so we're standing here on the corner of Albert and Victoria Street, right where the Aotea station is going to be, and you can see the early works for the City Rail Link behind me. They're starting to do the preparatory works, moving a stormwater tunnel. The City Rail Link is already underway. It's going to be completely fantastic for this area and in fact the entire Auckland region, because it's a great fix for the Auckland rail network.
Patrick Reynolds is a long-time supporter of the City Rail Link and better rail in our biggest city.
This is a little bit of a champagne moment, I think.
What about marks out of 10?
For Auckland, this was a pretty good 8, I'd say. It's not fast-tracking the City Rail Link. It's merely catching up with the council's program.
Catching up it may be, but Patrick Reynolds likes what the Prime Minister had to say.
This represents quite a shift in the way that this government in particular thinks about Auckland.
It's a sign, he says, that the government is finally taking Auckland seriously.
A lot of things are very encouraging about today's speech. I especially like the way that John Key couched the decisions about the importance of the Auckland economy for the entire country. I'm glad that he didn't feel the need to announce multiple zillions of extra urban highways, because that era is coming to a close. We have a nearly complete motorway network in Auckland. So the announcement today just gives certainty to the council's program of the works for the City Rail Link. So the works that are starting and are about to step up in earnest in a few months' time here will continue seamlessly through, instead of possibly pausing while waiting for the government to get on board.
It's full steam ahead for Auckland City Rail Link. For Checkpoint, Kim Baker-Wilson.
Coming up next, a neighbour who says he's been complaining to authorities for more than a decade about cattle in Lake Taylor, and the 17-year-old who turns 18 just 3 days after voting in the flag referendum begins, but 2.5 weeks before it ends. So can he vote or not? Now, we would love to hear from you. We're fascinated about what you think about the City Rail Link and the government getting in behind it, and how the Auckland Council comes up with their money. And we're equally interested whether you're in Auckland or outside of Auckland. Please contact us. Email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz, Facebook and Twitter, Checkpoint RNZ, and the website is radionz.co.nz. Don't forget, if you're somewhere where you can stop driving or cooking or whatever, and you can watch us, we are on Freeview Channel 50 and live streaming on rnz.co.nz/checkpoint. checkpoint. We turn now to Lake Taylor, scene of cattle in the water in direct violation of Rule 5.68 of the Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan, which explicitly excludes, and I quote, cattle standing in any lake. Formal complaints have been made and ECAN say they're looking into it. But tonight we hear from a neighbour who says he's been complaining about the cattle for a decade and nothing has been done. The land is majority owned by Chief Justice Sian Elias and her husband Hugh Fletcher. Edward Snowden, and yes, that is his name, owns a holiday batch next door.
It's on Lake Katrine, which is encompassed by the lake station, the station in question.
Okay, have you seen cattle from this station in the water before?
Many times. I have a long memory of the area. My family's had a batch there for a very long time, in fact, back to the 1950s. And so we can go right back, yes, cattle in there, and then in the more recent times, of course, when it's become unacceptable to run stock into fresh water, they're repeatedly in places where they shouldn't be. And deliberately put there, I should say, as well.
Yes, can I clarify this? Is there an absence of fencing that is allowing the stock to get into the water, or is it your assessment that gates are being opened to enable the stock to get into the water?
Okay, in particular, that picture that I've sent through concerns Charlie's Point, the 3-mile tributary of Lake Sumner, and that is inside the Forest Park. Now, there is a fence and a gate at the corner of Lake Sumner where the grazing, the leasehold grazing, adjoins the Forest Park. And regularly, in order to obtain a little bit of extra winter grazing, if nobody's watching, cows get put through the gate, driven through the forest, and into the 3-mile clearing where there's a small bit of riverbed and grass, and they're wintered over in there. So yes, they have been for probably, if I think back, at least 15 years, off and on, cows have been driven through and grazed there for the winter.
So it's your assessment this is willful, not accidental?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. What have you done in terms of... What have you done in terms of trying to talk to the owners, the people running the stock, local authorities, the ministry, anyone?
I've talked to the station manager. I have phoned up repeatedly Doc over the years and said there's stock in the 3-mile. What are we going to do about it? I've phoned ECAN in later years as ECAN has become more accessible. And so usually the answer is... I'll get an answer back in a few weeks' time, and it will usually be Doc, and they'll say, yes, we've phoned up the manager of Lake Station, and he says, oh, yes, the cows must have escaped around the gate, around the fence, and they've gone in there by themselves. Yes, I'll take them out. And come about spring, yes, they're driven out.
So you've raised this with both Doc and ECAN previously, yes. And you have evidence, you have formal correspondence and evidence of the fact that they have acknowledged they are aware of the situation, they've replied to you?
Yes, they've replied, but it's all been phone calls, so that's harder to show, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose it is. So what is your take on the fact that it's continuing?
Well, because I believe that the station has an attitude that it's business and they would take no regard of the values of the area, which are extremely high. It's a landscape of national significance, and they just refuse to basically acknowledge that these places deserve protection.
Okay, let's set aside what ECAN says about this, and they are very clear, in fact explicitly so, and that is that no stock should be standing in a lake, full stop.
Right, and of course that is because of our new land and water.
Absolutely, but what's your personal objection to it?
Well, in particular, the photograph I've sent through of them running stock in the 3-mile riverbed above Lake Sumner, that is a very special area with very high values. Because it was always a protected open clearing in heavy ancient forest, it held special herb fields, it has native orchids growing there, it was a thriving population of parakeets and kaka in there, And in the latter stages, the last decade, where this occurrence has been happening quite regularly, I've seen the turf deteriorate, it's trampled. I've seen the river polluted with dead carcasses of animals which haven't made it through the winter. I've seen gorse now heavily introduced into the area. There's no way that gorse could have got in there in the upper reaches of that river, but it's been brought in by the cattle, and so now we're trying to chop the gorse out. It's ridiculous. What's it done? It's given the farm another few $100s. This is a very valuable area. It just makes me cry to look at it.
Are you aware that other people have complained?
Yes, I believe so. Yes. Of course, we've got a difficulty here because we're always phoning. We're talking to the manager, but then that becomes very problematic because of the attitude of the manager. Yeah.
Is there a new manager? Has the manager died in recent years?
Yes, that's right. He died just before Christmas.
Okay, so are you expecting that might change now, with appropriate respect to the deceased manager? But are you expecting that something may change under a new regime?
I would really hope so, and I guess it's been great that those photos of the cows in Taylor appeared, because we've been trying for a long time to have something done. Suddenly this becomes national news, and it would be very good to see a changed attitude, and it would also be very good to see a changed attitude in other parts of the high country, because while I'm very familiar with this particular area and the details of it, when I travel into other parts of the the high country, I see the same thing happening, and it's just unacceptable.
So that was a neighbour, Edward Snowden. The land in question is majority owned by Chief Justice Shana Elias and her husband Hugh Fletcher. Yesterday, our reporter Sally Murphy visited the station. Mr Fletcher told her that although Lake Taylor was fenced off from cattle, he occasionally let them into the lake for a drink on hot days. We've repeatedly left messages for Mr Fletcher and Dame Shana Elias. Neither has returned our calls about those claims. RNZ asked today to talk to both the Environment Minister, who was Nick Smith, and the Minister for Primary Industries, Nathan Guy. Both declined our invitations to be interviewed. Mr Guy's office sent a statement saying farmers have spent over $1 billion on environmental investment over the last 5 years, according to a recent survey by Fed Farmers and Dairy NZ. As part of this, dairy farmers have fenced off around 95% of their waterways. He goes on to say the government has an ambitious program of work on improving New Zealand's freshwater management, and the public will be consulted this year on latest land and water forum proposals. They include recommendations to exclude pigs, deer, dairy and beef cattle from waterways relative to the type of farming terrain, and a timetable for achieving that. Once again, both Nathan Guy and Nick Smith declined invitations to be interviewed. The Land and Water Forum advises the government on freshwater management. Its members range from dairy giant Fonterra to Forest and Bird and the Environmental Defence Society. Last year it released a report recommending all stock be excluded from most waterways by 2030. A bit of overlay here in terms of what Nathan Guy was saying to us. The forum's chair, Alistair Bisley, is in our Wellington studio and joins us now. Welcome, Alistair. Now, Alistair, this is going to be confusing for people on the radio, but look down so people on the radio just ignore the next 3 seconds. Look down the camera, which is to your left. That's it. That's me. I'm there.
I'm looking at it
Excellent.
now.
Thank you so much. Welcome, Alistair. And for people on the radio who are listening on the radio, I apologise. Is it acceptable to have cattle standing in water like this?
Well, the forum decided that it was a good idea not just to have to depend on voluntary agreements and not just to have to depend on a whole range of quite different council rules for this. So we've actually proposed to the government that they should put in place a national regime which will, as you said earlier, exclude not only cows but also pigs and deer.
So wait a sec. I just want I want
bodies.
some absolute clarity around this. Under that national regime, this kind of thing would not take place, full stop.
I hope not, John. Without knowing more about the detail, it's hard to be precise. But I'm not sufficiently aware of the nature of the territory.
Okay,
and so forth.
let's talk in broad brush terms then. Ideally, under this regime you are proposing, would cattle be standing in a lake on many, many occasions?
I hope not. I can't see how that would happen.
Okay, how do you get buy-in?
How do you get buy-in? Well, the forum, as you said, is a highly representative body. It includes everybody from Fonterra to Federated Farmers to iwi to Forest and Bird and power generators. So when the forum agrees, that means there's a lot of buy-in.
So okay, yeah, absolutely. So that's theoretical buy-in. Let's talk about practical buy-in, actual on-the-land buy-in. How do you ensure that people don't think, gosh, it's a hot day, gosh, those cows are looking thirsty, gosh, I'm just going to open the gate and let them into the lake or into the river? Should there be compulsion? Should there be fines? How punitive is the regime? How do you control it?
Well, we're suggesting that there are a set of national rules which apply to the farming, to more intensive farming areas. And we're suggesting that councils should make rules on more difficult terrain to deal with the priorities in those areas.
So what would the national rule say?
I guess, the national rule we haven't tried to draft, but we have said that cows should be excluded from water bodies. We've talked about the various ways in which that can happen. We've talked about the sort of water bodies which it can happen in relation to, because we want to expand the types of stream and so forth that they're excluded from. And we've also talked about riparian management and how that might be improved.
Okay,
so we've
Alistair,
suggested a whole range of stuff which now needs to be done.
Right, and when would you like to see it done by? When would the Land and Water Forum like to see cattle not in water by?
Well, we hope that in the first place dairy cows will be excluded by 2017, and we've suggested a range of other times that we should get them excluded by when they're for other stock types and in other kinds of terrain.
Alistair Bisley from the Land and Water Forum, thank you very much indeed, Alistair. We appreciate your time. To the flag referendum now. Very quickly, we're off to Christchurch where 17-year-old Finn Jackson has a small problem. Finn's 17 but turns 18 on March 6. That's 3 days after voting opens in the second part of the referendum, but it runs till March 24, by which stage Finn will have been 18 for 8 days. You have to be 18 to vote, right? Well, Finn will be 18 before the referendum, so he can vote, right? Well, no. An Electoral Commission staffer told him he couldn't. Finn is passionate about politics and he didn't think that was right, so he contacted us.
Well, yeah, I thought that as when you're 18 you have the right to vote, and there's time when I can vote. I thought that naturally I'll be able to vote in that time, but I don't know, it's a bit confusing.
Had you provisionally enrolled? Because that seems to be important, doesn't it? Prior to your 18th birthday, if you've provisionally enrolled.
I hadn't, but I went in to check if what provisionally enrolling would actually do, because yeah, apparently it doesn't allow you to vote if you turn 18 after the enrolment period has ended.
So you've been told you can't vote in the referendum?
Yes.
And are you quite upset about that, Finn?
Well, I don't really care about the flag that much, but it's just the fact that I should be allowed to have the right to vote, and this kind of thing must have happened to other people for actual election campaigns, and yeah, I just don't think it's really fair.
Well, you know someone else it's happened to. You can provide a compelling example because you're a twin, right?
Yes, I am.
And is your twin a brother or a sister?
He's my brother.
And so he's in the same position. I suspect he's possibly less interested than you, but if he was interested, he would be in the same position, right?
Oh no, he's just as interested as me. In fact, he's a youth MP for the Youth Parliament this year.
Is he?
Yeah.
Okay, right. A highly political household. Well, Finn, we have gone to the Electoral Commission, and I want to tell you what they say, because we called them up and said this seems on the face of it slightly odd because you are 18 during the life of the referendum, and so is your twin brother. And they have said they are very sorry you were given the wrong information. They say if someone turns 18 during the voting period and has provisionally enrolled before voting begins on March 3rd, so there's still time for you to do that. They can vote. All you need to do if you turn 18 between March 3rd and March 24 is complete, sign and return an enrolment form. The office says they are very sorry, Finn, that you were given the wrong information, and they will be reminding all their officers of this. So because of you, Finn, because of you trying to do this and because of you contacting us, not only do you get to vote, but you are ensuring this doesn't happen to other people like you.
Wow. Thanks. Yeah, that's really cool.
It is really cool. It's also, Finn, an object lesson in what happens when you participate, right? When you raise your voice and ask a question and say, hey, what's going on here?
Yep. Yeah. Well, everyone always wants young people to get involved in politics, so I thought it was a bit weird if we weren't actually allowed to do the enrolment thing. So, yeah, well, cool.
Thanks for you speaking up, Finn. You can. And so can you tell your brother from us he can, and everyone in the same position who turns 18 during the referendum can also. Why are you so interested in politics?
Well, I grew up in an extremely political household. My parents were originally journalists and then political advisors to one or other of the Christchurch mayors earlier in the century. And then a few years ago, I was just flicking between TV channels and saw the GCSB debate on the GCSB bill, and I thought, oh, that looks interesting. So then I went and did work experience at a political party office, and I've just been hooked ever since.
And have you got an ambition? Do you want to get into politics?
I'm not sure if I've actually got the temperament for being a politician myself, but I'd like to get involved in policy analysis and creation, because I don't know, I just find that really interesting. And yeah.
Well, you have, at the tender age of 17, almost 18, and that is a crucial point, already achieved something worth achieving. So congratulations, Finn, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Go, Finn. 5:33 is the time, a little bit late. My fault, I apologise. Here is Katrina Batten with the news headlines.
Auckland's Mayor Len Brown says the government's full commitment to the downtown rail tunnel is just what the city needs. The government has today removed conditions for funding its share of the $2.5 billion city rail link, ensuring it can be completed without delays between stages. But Mr Brown says the council is still determined to get government agreement to allow it to introduce motorway charging to help pay for major transport projects in the city. The police say the victims of a serial rapist in Hamilton in 2007 no longer need to fear him with the closing of the case. DNA matching has confirmed that a Perth man living in Hamilton at the time 3 women were attacked was responsible. The man, who hasn't been named, died in July 2013. One person has been killed and another wounded in a gun battle between Oregon police and a militia group occupying a wildlife refuge. Amon Bundy, leader of the Pacific Patriots Network, has been arrested after an exchange of fire when his car was stopped by the police. The journalist Nicky Hager says the police will not be appealing against his High Court victory late last year. His home was searched in 2014 amid an investigation to identify sources who contributed to his book Dirty Politics. But the High Court ruled that the warrant used was fundamentally unlawful, and Nicky Hager's legal team says the author is now entitled to get his belongings back. Whanganui iwi say human remains returned to the tribe have been treated with dignity and buried in a traditional ceremony. The Whanganui Regional Museum has given the iwi about 70 remains or kōiwi, some of which had been in storage for more than 100 years. A local iwi leader, Gerard Albert, is unhappy that the kōiwi were in storage for so long. That's the headlines. I'll have more news, weather and sport at 6.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina. We look forward to it. 6 is 24 and a half minutes away. Let's turn to business news now with our business editor, Giles Beckford. And today we're going to look at the fortunes of a technology company that really is a household name, Apple. Giles, what is going on with Apple?
It's just record territory, John. They've just had their quarterly profit and they've just made, hang on to this, the biggest corporate profit in US history, 28 billion New Zealand dollars.
Is that a quarter?
For the 3 months ended December.
Goodness gracious me.
Nearly 75 million iPhones, 16 million iPads, 5 million Mac computers. I don't know how many Apple Watches or God knows what else, but it was the biggest on record and everyone's going, ooh, great. And then they said, hang on a moment, perhaps it's not quite so great because the growth, and this is what it's all about, the growth in sales was quite minute. And Tim Cook, the chief executive of Apple, said, well, actually the next 3 months, the first quarter of this year, we think we might even see a bit of a fall in sales. And that would be the first time in nearly 10 years. And that's what's worrying quite a few people. And the big worry is, of course, is that China, where they see that as a potentially strong growth market for them, is actually not going to deliver the goods for them, that the whole iPhone phenomenon is running out of steam. And from that point of view, the Apple watches are getting just a shade on the nervous side.
Yeah, I bet. It's fascinating, though, watching Apple in all respects. And I want to talk a little bit about tax because I'm fascinated by Apple's tax arrangements. But Apple do have a reputation for being somewhat pessimistic, not quite the right word, on their projections, because then they get to surprise on the upside, right? So is that a case of, is that what they're doing here, do you think, or actually is the luster off the iPhone a bit?
Well, I don't know. I think you pay your money and takes your chance. One of the big brokerages in the States has actually taken the bit by in the teeth, and they're saying almost definitely for their forecasts on their assessment of Apple, they will have anywhere up to a $5 billion drop in revenue in the next quarter.
Okay.
And from that point of view, you say the luster is coming off.
Yeah, that's meaningful, isn't it? Can we talk about Apple tax? Things just
they don't pay
things are starting to just nip at their heels a little bit, aren't they? Europe.
Well, yeah. I mean, 55% of Apple's profits come from overseas. Right? The average tax rate that Apple pays on those profits is 2%.
Yeah.
Imagine that. It's been calculated that Apple's probably managed not to pay, let's put it that way, not evaded, has avoided paying $59 billion to the US government or US authorities by their tax arrangements. And the way they do it is very simple. They use Ireland a lot, and Apple in Ireland buys a license from Apple in the States. It makes the iPhones, sells them all through Britain and Europe, brings the profits back. The profits are taxed at an Irish tax rate, which is 2%, or just a little bit under. And of course, they then just pass the earnings, the net earnings, on to the parent company. But as you say, people are nipping at the heels. The European Commission started to turn a little bit ugly about it last year. They've not just got Apple in their sights, they've also got people like Starbucks and Microsoft in their sights. But they're starting to say, can we look at your tax arrangements? And Apple must be thinking there is some politics in this to try and smooth things, because they've just reached a deal with the Italian government to pay back about $390 million to settle some tax grievances, shall we say.
It's a fascinating business, Giles. Can you tell us what the market's closed on?
I can tell you were worried about those 30 points that we lost yesterday.
Giles. You told me not to worry.
I told you not to worry. I found 6 of them today. We're up 6 points.
Thanks, Giles. Giles Bedford, our business editor. Thank you very much. For those of you I haven't already cajoled into listening to it via Twitter or some social media or other, I did do a podcast on Apple's operations in New Zealand. It is available on the Radio New Zealand website. They're extraordinarily high costs. A man who died in 2013 while living in Australia has been confirmed as a serial rapist who attacked 3 women in Hamilton in 2007. The man, who police are refusing to name, was identified through a conclusive DNA match provided by West Australian Police. At the time of the offending, Waikato Police identified hundreds of suspects, but the man who has been confirmed as the rapist was not one of them. Detective Inspector Chris Page has been leading the case since 2007 and explains how the investigation has unfolded.
So this was a matter that we announced to the public on the 2nd of August 2007, that we were concerned that we had a serial rape offender in Hamilton City. So since that time, it's been an extensive investigation where we've followed a large number of leads and lines that have taken us nowhere. In the course of that investigation, we had a DNA profile from the offender, and we lodged that DNA profile through Interpol in a number of countries overseas, including Australia. What's happened recently is that in May of 2013, a New Zealander living in Perth was arrested and dealt with by the Australian authorities, and in the course of that had his DNA taken to go on the Australian databank. In the normal course of events, that DNA profile was checked against outstanding crime scene samples, of which the Operation Phil sample was one of them, and a match was found. Once we became aware of this, we immediately commenced a request under the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act of the Australian authorities, and earlier this year we received the final detail in relation to the DNA match. On Saturday afternoon, the ESR from New Zealand provided me with the final confirmation that the identity of the expat Kiwi living in Western Australia was in fact the offender for the Operation Phil sexual attacks.
Have you spoken to the victims?
What we have done is two very important things. One is that we've spoken with the alleged offender's family and spent some time with them. What they tell us is that this is not the person they know, it's not the son that they know, and this is a complete departure from their observed behaviour. But in some respects for them it also answered some questions. And then yesterday we spent time with our victims, and they naturally are continuing to be traumatised by the violence inflicted by this man, but they were very grateful to receive the news, and it's quite a bit for them to take in, and we'll follow up with them again next week to see how they're going.
So they know he's no longer out there. In fact, he died in non-suspicious circumstances in July 2013. Have you any idea what happened in the intervening 6 years? He obviously left Hamilton, he went to Perth and did what?
So some of that detail we don't have, but one of the things that we did ask and that we have looked at is, has there been any additional offending between when we announced this on the 2nd of August 2007 and now?
Yeah.
And outside of the offence he was arrested for, and I'll talk to that in a moment, outside of that offence there's no other sign that he's committed any offending. Whilst he had a girlfriend in Australia, he didn't have a family, and there's nothing to suggest that he continued to offend over there. In relation to the offence he was arrested on, it was a minor offence, and more importantly probably for this inquiry was that it was non-sexual.
You worked very hard in 2007. You were on the case in 2007 when this happened, a serial rapist, and it was very disturbing for everyone involved, obviously. And I know at the time you drew up a list of possible suspects. Was he on it?
That's a good point, John. We looked closely once we knew who he was. We looked closely to see was he on our list, and no, he wasn't. Was he one of those people that we spoke to during the inquiry? No, he wasn't. And then we looked at his background and talked with his family, and there is nothing in his background or in any of the indicators that suggested anywhere to anybody that this man was a serial rapist and should be alerted to the police. This is completely out of the blue for the family. And so one of the things that we're going to do is talk with the family further about whether our criminal profilers can spend some time with them and look at this and see what we can learn.
Detective Inspector Chris Page, thank you so much for joining us. This is a tragic case, terrible, terrible crimes, but it must be good to know that this isn't going to happen again.
And that's one of the things really that we want to reiterate to the public of Hamilton, who have long held concerns about their safety on the basis that this serial rapist remained at large, and even more so for the victims. So it's really good to be able to give them a sense that they can feel safe about this man.
Detective Inspector Chris Page from the Waikato Police. A former Māori Affairs Minister, Dover Samuels, is challenging the Prime Minister and his delegation to come to Waitangi despite threats of a ban. Kingi Taurua has warned the government could be blocked from Te Tii Marae, the lower marae, if the TPP is signed, which is set to take place on February the 4th, the day before they're at Te Tii, 2 days before Waitangi Day. Dover Samuel says Te Tii Marae has traditionally been a place of robust debate, and Mr Key is aware of that. Māori Issues correspondent Mihi Narangi Forbes reports.
Ngāpuhi elder Dover Samuels has been on both sides of Waitangi's fierce debates. He's dished out challenges to the Crown from the Ngāpuhi Paipai, and as a Crown Minister, he's taken his fair share of lashings on the visitors' bench. Mr Samuel says it's an important way for the government to engage with Māori.
It is an opportunity for meaningful engagement between the leader of the country, between the Premier and his ministers.
He says talk of a ban is an easy way out for the Prime Minister, and Mr Samuel says he knows it.
I challenge the Prime Minister because this is an opportunity for the Prime Minister to duck away from his responsibilities to Ngāpuhi and to Māoridom in a way. This really is a way out. It's an avenue that's been opened to him, and it's the people that are going to miss out are actually Ngāpuhi beneficiaries, and the leaders of Ngāpuhi will miss out on the real opportunity for them to be able to question the Prime Minister on issues that only the Prime Minister can answer.
But speaking from Auckland today, the Prime Minister says he will answer questions on the government's record if he's invited.
Personally, I think it's important to go to the marae and talk about the government's plans and its record. So whether it's mixed ownership models, or whether it's mining, or whether it's a number of other initiatives, there have been protests in Waitangi. But in the end, if the invitation's there, I'll be going. If it's not, then I'll honour that.
The government pōwhiri at Te Tii Marae has consistently been the place where Māori have challenged the Crown for its failures to uphold the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. In 1995, Tamiiti spat at the feet of the Crown after the government announced it would introduce a cap on treaty settlements. In 2004, the former National Party leader Don Brash had mud thrown in his face after advocating one law for everyone at his Orewa speech just days before. Mr Samuel says an open invitation to the Crown should always be extended as treaty partner.
Well, I am disappointed that the Prime Minister has been advised that he's not welcome at the Te Marae in Ngāpuhi. I don't believe that the statement is one that reflects the attitude of Ngāpuhi Nui Tonu. I'm mindful that we have over 130,000 Ngāpuhi beneficiaries. I believe that those people would support the Prime Minister coming onto the Te Marae.
This year, Mr Samuel says the Trans-Pacific Partnership is shaping up to be the big issue at Waitangi. John Campbell says he's happy to talk about it, but he's not sure he can convince all Māori.
Well, I'm not saying I'm going to convince every person up there, because some people will have made up their mind, but they'll be making up their mind with misinformation. There's nothing in TPP that cuts across the treaty.
Dover Samuel says while the TPP issue will likely dominate the protests, he'll personally be looking for answers from the government on its mishandling of the Ngāpuhi Treaty settlement, particularly the iwi's mandate process. For Checkpoint, this is me, Ngārangi Forbes.
Lots and lots of feedback coming in to Checkpoint. Here's a representative sample on the City Rail Link. James says it's great, we are getting a rail link. James is obviously an Aucklander, but somewhat embarrassing. A modern city like Auckland has no airport rail link. Lots of people pointing out the government is claiming credit they don't deserve. Lots of people suggesting the government's claiming credit they don't deserve, and this was a council initiative. On cows, Yannick asks, is the $750 proposed ECAN fine for each cow or a one-off fine? Yannick, it is a one-off fine, so that's $750 for the lot, not per cow. Thank you for your feedback. It's fantastic to hear from you. Let's talk sport. The draw for the basketball's Olympic qualifying series has been confirmed this morning, and both the New Zealand men's and women's team will have to face France and beat France if they want to get to the Olympics. I asked Matt Chatterton, in order for the New Zealanders to get there, well, who else will they have to beat?
We're going to have to beat France, and we're also going to have to beat the Philippines. We're playing in the Philippines, so that's going to be quite a challenge going up against the Philippines, host nation, and then France themselves are ranked 5th in the world. In the women's draw, we're going over to France, and we're playing France over there, and we'll also be playing Cuba. Now, France and the women are actually ranked 4th, so they're even higher than the men's national team.
So we've got to beat teams ranked way above us.
Yes, that is true, but if you look at past performances, New Zealand in these sort of situations can actually do quite well. We played France back in 2010 at the World Championships and actually beat them 82-70 in the group stages, and then we went on to lose to Russia, but that's another story.
Yeah, but we have a nice line in giant killing, is the point you're making, right?
Yes, exactly. I mean, we sort of live up to the reputation of, we can do that sort of thing. We can be a giant killer in these sort of situations, and in this sort of high intense situation where there's a lot of pressure on a number of teams to qualify from their nation, there are often upsets.
Yeah. Let's look at poor old Mohamed Amir. Is he poor old Mohamed Amir? This is the interesting question. He was done for spot fixing, right?
Yes.
He was punished. He served his time. He comes back. He starts again. He turns up in New Zealand and he gets abused.
Yes.
Now, this is the Pakistani cricketer. What sort of thing were people doing in Wellington when he was playing?
Well, yeah, this happened obviously at the Basin Reserve, just in the first ODI between Pakistan and New Zealand, and he was in fact taunted from fans in the crowd. He was out fielding on the boundary and fans behind him were taunting him with cash. They were holding out money, sort of going, you know, shaking it in front of him. And obviously that would have been a little bit of a shake-up for him. But it wasn't even him that ended up complaining. It was the Pakistani captain that ended up saying this isn't good enough and went to the umpires. And ironically, it was the captain who first originally came out and said he didn't want to play with Mohamed Amir. He didn't think he deserved his spot back in the Pakistani team.
In fact, he was really unequivocal about that. But I guess the point is Mohamed Amir has been punished, he served his time, and life goes on, right? Unless you believe he should be banned for life. He's back. Is that the point? Or is this part of the rough and tumble of sport that you do this kind of thing to opposing teams?
Well, I mean, I suppose the other question too is can New Zealanders sometimes be bad sports, the spectators themselves? I mean, there are a number of people that have been saying that it was bad or, you know, it's a bit of banter, a bit of sledging, you know, that goes on in New Zealand, in cricket, sorry. But, yeah, there's been mixed reaction. I think even the Pakistan cricket bowling coach, I believe, might have said that you know, sometimes these things can get slightly blown out of proportion, but it was actually the board who came out and said that Amir was shaken up a little bit by the situation, and that, you know, this sort of thing they didn't think it would happen. But Waqar Younis, the coach of the Pakistani cricket team, when he first came to New Zealand last week and faced his first press conference, he was asked about that. Did he expect any animosity? And he said, you know, there's going to be that. You know, we've got to expect it. There are still people out there who think that he shouldn't be playing. So, you know, it wasn't as though they're coming over here thinking that it was going to be all, you know, rosy and everything was going to be fine.
What we know about Amir is he took money to bowl no balls, right? Mm-hmm. And this casts a dark shadow over him forevermore. He may now be the most reformed and straightest player in the entire game of cricket globally. But every time he bowls a no ball, every time he bowls a rank full toss and someone scores a 4 off it, the shadow is going to return, isn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, when you look back on it, it was 2010 when he did it. He was still 18 years old. I mean, we don't know the circumstances exactly around what happened with that, whether or not, you know, he was forced into the situation that he had to do it. I mean, Pakistan's cricket team isn't allowed to play in big tournaments like the EPL where their players get massive amounts of money.
For jam,
so you can see why that some of these players, when they get pressured into these situations, they see it as an opportunity to make money. But still, obviously, it's totally illegal and shouldn't happen. But I mean, at the end of the day, he was very young when it happened. The people around him, you know, some of them weren't the best people to be around. And he obviously got put into a situation he probably, looking back on it, didn't want to be in. And I mean, the worst thing was actually that in the Pakistan report that came out this morning about this whole incident that happened, they even quoted a couple of moments where he bowled wides, and his first ball that he bowled in New Zealand was a wide in the T20, and then he also bowled another wide in the ODI. And it seems they're really scrutinising everything he does. No matter what he does, there's always going to be questions.
The sports reporter, Matt Chatterton, always going to be questions over him. Not over Matt, obviously. The draw, so New Zealand got to beat France. Let's go to Dunedin, because while we've been turning up the heat in the studio, Paul Lecomte in Dunedin has been watching from home and adjusting. Hi, Paul, you're on. You're on. Has been adjusting the stovetop. From our first day on air, Paul's been cooking pulled pork, butter chicken, filet pastries, fish and chips, feta and bacon parcels, you name it, while he's been watching and listening to Checkpoint. And every night he tweets a description of what he's cooking, and people are now joining in, Cooking with John, contributing photos and tweets of their own curry laksa, Moroccan lemon chicken, terrines. So in honour of all the people who listen or watch in their kitchen each night, here via Skype is Paul to tell us what he's cooking tonight.
Evening, John. How are you doing?
Yeah, but good. I mangled the intro. That's good. I'm just because I'm delighted to be in your kitchen with you. Well, can you pour me a wine? Can I have a drink? Can I have a drink?
Actually, it's beer tonight. Sorry, John.
Oh, it's what?
Beer.
Oh no, that's all right. No, I'd love a glass of beer. But what are you cooking?
Tonight, because it's so cold, I've decided to go with a shepherd's pie.
Oh, so shepherd's pie. So wait a sec. This is shepherd's pie is yesterday's lamb, isn't it? Is that right or not? Or are you using fresh lamb?
This one's got good old Kiwi beef. I'm not sure if they've been waiting in New Zealand lakes or not, but it's got good old Kiwi beef in it. And it's got about 9 different vegetables in it.
Oh, yum. And wait a sec, I'm getting my cottage pie and my shepherd's pie confused. Has it got potato on top?
Oh yeah, it's always got to have potato on top and then cheese on top of that.
Yeah, that'd get a National Heart Foundation tick. You know, when no one's looking, I like to pour Worcester sauce on top of a shepherd's pie.
Oh, it's got Worcester sauce and a bit of barbecue sauce in it as well.
Yeah, good. So you're standing there each night watching Checkpoint, right, or listening to Checkpoint, or both, and cooking up a storm. And lots of people are kind of engaging with you and your recipes, aren't they?
Yeah, I thought it was just a good, fun idea to see what people are doing. I mean, when we used to watch that other show at 7 p.m, it was always dishes time. So instead, at 5 p.m, it's cooking dinner time. So why not?
Yeah, you've got kids. Your kids, we know your kids actually, Paul. We're fans of your kids and the old show.
I know
the show that comes. And what do they think about your cooking?
Oh, they love my cooking, actually. Well, I hope they do. They're not here at the moment. They're at cricket practice, actually, so they can't complain anyway.
Yeah, they're too sensible to say otherwise. You're having a good summer. It's a crappy day there today, but you've had some lovely weather, haven't you?
Oh, we've had some really nice days. We've had that really stinking hot day over 36, but it's been a bit cool, so we switched to the winter menu just for the next couple of days.
Right. What's your Twitter handle, Paul?
515 Design.
Okay, excellent. So if you want to know what Paul's cooking each night, follow him on Twitter, Paul Lecomte. Thanks so much, Paul. Oh,
Not a problem, John.
I'd love a beer and a shepherd's pie. My mouth is watering. Paul Lecomte, who is a good man in Dunedin. A surge of American tourists since the restoration of diplomatic ties is testing the limits of Cuba's tourism industry. Here's Deborah Lutterbeck from Reuters to explain.
Havana is open for business. Once a rare sight, Americans are now swarming Old Havana's colonial squares and narrow streets, along with Europeans and Canadians. It's something of a mixed blessing, says Luis Carlos Benvenuto Solos, owner of a private restaurant.
The groups that are coming are also bigger, so that is good for business. It's a big challenge because it's the issue of suppliers and how to get everything to maintain the same standard and the same quality. It makes it very complicated. Since there are no wholesale stores, we have to buy in the same stores as everyone else, and there isn't a lot of stock, actually.
It's not exactly what American tourist Jerry Christ was expecting.
Amazed at the fact that there are so many tourists down here. I didn't realize the depth and the expanse of how many different people from all over the world are here already. And also Americans. I have seen more Americans than I thought that I would see down here.
In December 2014, the U.S. and Cuba ended 5 decades of animosity and agreed to restore diplomatic ties. More than a year later, it looks as though there was plenty of pent-up demand. Never mind that there are limited hotel rooms and that the island is struggling to cope with an almost 20% spike in tourism. Those worries can be washed away with a day at the beach.
It's one extraordinary place, Cuba is. I've never been there. Have you been there, Katrina Batten?
No, I haven't.
No.
But it looks amazing.
It does.
That beach looked beautiful.
Ooh. Anyway, that was Deborah Lutterbeck from Reuters. After the news at 6 o'clock, we're going to return to the subject of the City Rail Link, and we're going to talk politics with Jane Patterson. What are the politics in this? But it's 6 o'clock. Also going to talk to the Greens about managing the waterways. You are listening to Checkpoint on RNZ with John Campbell. We are delighted to have your company, and here is Katrina Batten with the RNZ News at 6 o'clock.
Ngā mihi nui, good evening. Auckland's mayor and a business leader have welcomed the government's decision to fully commit to the city's downtown rail tunnel project. The government has today removed previous conditions from its funding offer, ensuring the City Rail Link avoids a possible delay partway through its construction. Our Auckland correspondent Todd Nile reports.
The Mayor, Len Brown, says the project now has the certainty it needs. An initial stage has begun, but major tunnelling work due to start in 2018 might have faced delays because of the government's previous conditions. The Chief Executive of the Employers and Manufacturers Association, John Campbell, believes the government has recognised its previous stance might have cost it votes in Auckland. The Mayor and the Prime Minister John Campbell expect the cost to be shared almost 50-50, but still haven't agreed over whether Auckland can introduce motorway charges to raise funds. In Auckland, Todd Nile.
A Canterbury holiday homeowner says he's been complaining for 15 years about cattle owned by the Chief Justice and her husband having access to lakes in the high country. Dame Sian Elias and businessman Hugh Fletcher are being investigated by the Canterbury Regional Council after cattle they own were photographed standing in a lake. Edward Snowden, who has a batch on Loch Katrine, says he's made numerous complaints to the council and the Department of Conservation, but nothing's been done. He told Checkpoint with John Campbell the station manager usually says the cattle have escaped through gates or fences, but Mr Snowden says the cattle are deliberately put in those areas. The Department of Conservation has today contacted another farmer whose cattle were seen wandering in Otago waterways. Trampers sent photos to RNZ saying they were shocked to see the cattle defecating in the Matukituki Valley, just off the Rob Roy Glacier track, which leads to the Mount Aspiring National Park. DOC has so far not said what, if any, action has been taken against the farmer. However, the Otago Regional Council says it had no complaints and that, going by the photo, it appears the water protection rules don't appear to have been breached. The former Māori Affairs Minister Dover Samuel says the Prime Minister and his delegation should attend Waitangi despite threats of a ban. Mr Samuel says Te Tii Marae has traditionally been a place of robust debate, and John Campbell is well aware of that. Our Māori Issues correspondent Mihi Narangi Forbes reports.
The Ngāpuhi elder has been on both sides of Waitangi's fierce debates. He's dished out challenges to the Crown from the Ngāpuhi Paipai, and as a Crown Minister, taken his fair share of lashings on the visitors' bench. Now he's challenging John Campbell to front up at Te Tii Marae and address the issues facing Māori. The Prime Minister, speaking in Auckland today, took up that challenge, saying he too thinks it's important to go on to the marae to discuss the government's record. This is Mihi Narangi Forbes.
The leader of an armed group that's been occupying a wildlife refuge in Oregon has been arrested by the United States federal authorities. The militia leader, Amon Bundy, was detained along with 4 others after a confrontation in which shots were fired and one suspect was killed. Amon Bundy and his supporters occupied the refuge at the beginning of this month as part of a long-running dispute over land rights with the federal government. A derailed freight train has been cleared from tracks near National Park. Wagons came off the line yesterday and the route reopened at 4:30 today. Freight services have restarted and the Northern Explorer tourist service will run tomorrow as normal. Investigations into the cause are ongoing. 2 people are in hospital after a van carrying 6 people crashed near Charleston on the west coast this afternoon. 2 rescue helicopters and 2 ambulances rushed to the scene of the crash, and 1 injured passenger was airlifted to Nelson Hospital and another to Greymouth Hospital. Ambulance officers treated another 4 people at the scene for minor injuries. A man has been airlifted to hospital after the car he was driving crashed through barriers on a bridge on State Highway 45 in South Taranaki and plummeted 10 metres into a river below. The police say the man doesn't have life-threatening injuries but is in Taranaki Base Hospital overnight for observation. Emergency services were called to Kopokonui, south of Manaia, early this afternoon. It took them about an hour to get the man, who was conscious and talking to his rescuers, out. State Highway 45 between South and Lower Glen Roads has reopened. To sport, New Zealand men's basketball coach Paul Henare says he expected the team would face a European powerhouse in order to qualify for the Rio Olympics. The Tall Blacks have been drawn in a 6-team tournament in Manila in July, involving France, Turkey, the Philippines, Senegal and Canada. New Zealand will have to face the 5th-ranked French in the group stage, but Henare says he wasn't surprised by the draw.
Wherever you go, you're going to have to beat a tough team. We've drawn probably one of the better teams in France, but for us to qualify to Rio, we're always going to have to beat a European powerhouse, I believe. So to have them in our pool, it's a good first up test.
In the women's draw, the Tall Ferns head to France for their qualifier, where they'll also face the French and Cuba. Rain in Christchurch has forced the domestic one-day cricket playoff between Canterbury and Otago to be abandoned. That means Canterbury go on to face Central Districts in Saturday's final in New Plymouth. The Kiwis will face off with the Kangaroos twice this year in Australia after the first ever Rugby League test in Perth was announced for mid-October ahead of the Four Nations tournament in Britain. The fixture adds to the already announced May Anzac tests at Newcastle, but it also confirms that New Zealand won't host an international this year. And German 7th seed Angelique Kerber will play Britain's Johanna Konta for a place in the Australian Tennis Open final. Kerber knocked out the two-time champion Victoria Azarenka today in a big upset, while Konta beat Chinese qualifier Shuai Zhong in the last women's quarter-final. That's the news.
A major arrest.
We heard the police helicopters. We sort of sense that something was going on. There's definitely a sense of relief.
Climate change denied.
The death of climate change denial. There are people who are willfully ignorant about climate change.
Signing the TPP.
Māori are almost unanimous in saying we don't think it should be signed at all, let alone that close to Waitangi.
Staying ahead. Morning reports with Guy Aspinall and Susie Ferguson. Weekdays from 6. Then on 9 to noon, why parents of students needing exam help need to act now. And after 10, how an Auckland couple with a small GP practice in Otara have built the largest private clinician-owned network in the country. Ranja Patel from Nirvana Health Group is my guest. Join me, Catherine Ryan, from 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Met service weather now to midnight tomorrow for Northland to Kapiti, including the central high country and Bay of Plenty. Showers mainly afternoon and evenings, some heavy with thunderstorms. For Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, rain with heavy falls tomorrow, easing to a few showers in the afternoon. Wellington and South Wairarapa, low cloud and patchy drizzle or rain, gradually clearing tomorrow. Nelson and Marlborough, excluding the Kaikoura coast, occasional rain, clearing tomorrow morning. Buller and Westland, rain easing to isolated showers tomorrow morning and becoming confined to the ranges in the afternoon. Canterbury and the Kaikoura coast, rain easing to patchy drizzle late tomorrow morning. Otago and Southland, patchy drizzle, mainly near the coast, fine breaks inland tomorrow afternoon. For Fiordland, cloudy periods. The Chatham Islands, low cloud. Rain developing early tomorrow. It's just gone 6:08.
Thanks, Katrina. Patchy. Patchy was the word du jour in the weather forecast.
Yeah.
Patchy drizzle.
It's always patchy drizzle somewhere.
If it wasn't patchy, it wouldn't be drizzle, would it? It'd be rain.
Okay, you can argue about that with the Met Service.
Thank
you very much.
6:08 on Checkpoint. The City Rail Link is one step closer for Aucklanders, but they might also be facing a fuel tax or congestion charges to pay for it. John Key has confirmed government funding for the $2.5 billion project to allow major work to start earlier. In the past, the government has been lukewarm about the Auckland Council using taxes or tolls to raise money to pay for major transport projects. We're going to discuss this with Jane Patterson in about a minute. John Key says the government raises its share of the costs to pay the City Rail Link, and how it does so is up to the councillors and mayors to a point.
They'd have to justify that. So our main point has really been there are a number of options available to the council. So if they just simply put on an extra toll, firstly they'd have to convince Aucklanders why that's a good idea relative to what it's doing and who's paying the toll vis-a-vis who's getting the support. Secondly, I think they'd have to prove that sits as a bigger priority than reallocating expenditure, maybe debt or a number of other options. They have a big balance sheet, they have lots of options available to them. But in the end, I'm neither the Mayor of Auckland nor never want to be the Mayor of Auckland. So I'll leave that to either the current Mayor or the future Mayor and Council to sort that process.
Mr Key made another commitment today to streamline the consenting process for the east-west roading project in Auckland. It will have the status of a road of national significance, which means construction could be fast-tracked. Mr Key was asked how that would affect people who own houses that will have to be removed before construction can go ahead.
Well, they'll absolutely have the right to put up their argument, but equally what I'd say is that sometimes we are just forced to, in the national interest and the interest of Aucklanders, to call in a project and ultimately build a road of national significance. We do that right around the country, and we've done that in the history of New Zealand right from building State Highway 1. So people will have a legitimate right. The Transport Agency will work with them through the Public Works Act. There's a very fair process.
John Key. Well, John Key is in Auckland. Jane Patterson, our political editor, is in Auckland also, and she joins us in the studio now. Nice to see you, Jane. This is fascinating, isn't it? So the government is now behind the City Rail link.
Yes, it is. In principle, of course, there's always a codicil. It did actually give them a commitment in 2013 that it was willing to get on board. But today, John Key has said that it will fund the government share to get the work in its major tunnelling. So it costs a lot of money. Get it going by 2018 rather than 2020, which means it really meets the timetable that the Auckland Council wanted in the first place. John Key also said today that there has to be a contract still negotiated between Auckland Council and the government, and things like who's going to own the rail link, who's going to manage it. But he also did say today that there will be about a 50-50 split, which has always sort of been the formula: government pay half and the council pay half. So that's about where it's settled. So
what led the government to this point? Because if we cast our mind back to when the idea was first mooted and Len Brown was really pushing it hard, kind of on his own at first, Stephen Joyce, who was Transport Minister at the time, was almost openly derisory. So why the government here now?
I think there are two aspects to it. The first one appears to be a real pickup in rail usage. So Len Brown saying that there are 9,000 extra rail passengers per day in Auckland. And his argument has always been if you give Aucklanders a good public rail system, they will use it. And in fact, that was one thing that John Key said today, one that there's been an appetite shown by Aucklanders, and also to give investment certainty, because of course this rail link where it is dependent on a whole lot of other projects and buildings and all sorts of things. So unless that was really nailed down, it was going to be quite difficult for the project to potentially get ahead on its timetable. Also, I think politically, Labour and the Greens and the Auckland Council have all been lined up alongside this project, and the National Party or the government has pretty much been the odd one out. And I think it's just maybe come to the conclusion it's worth getting on board. It has partially committed, but with an election coming up.
Another fascinating repositioning of position from the government is on the subject of how the Auckland contribution itself is paid for. So roughly half the money is going to come from central government, half the money is going to come from the city itself. And this might include a fuel tax or tolling, right?
More specifically, maybe congestion charges.
Congestion charges. Now, the government was saying, no way. But there seems to be a move here too, right?
I think there's absolutely been a move in terms of the government's willingness to allow Auckland to levy these charges. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is that when fuel taxes or congestion charges have been raised in the past by Auckland Council, it has been for different projects. It's been for general transport projects.
Good point.
So you have to keep that in mind. So the government's argument then was, we don't think it's fair that you charge taxpayers and ratepayers a toll for roads they've already paid for out of their general transport funds. For this specific project, the government seems to be taking a slightly different view. John Key was saying today that he's not ruling it out, that congestion charges, fuel tax, potentially tolling on motorways could be part of the package that the Auckland Council may want to consider, and the government would be on board with that. So in the past, they've basically said they would veto fuel taxes or extra levies like this for those other general transport projects. Today, John Key saying it's up to the Auckland Council and it's up to Aucklanders whether they would support their council in doing that.
The rest of the country, and I've had this when I've been once famous in the West Coast, someone walked up to me and was very angry and said, I'm sick of paying for your bloody roads. Now they're going to pay for our bloody railway as well. So how is the politics of that going to be managed?
I think it has to be managed very carefully. I mean, I suppose in the straight numbers game, Aucklanders make up about a third of the voting population. So anything you do to keep Auckland happy is going to reward you well at the polls. There's such a concentration of voters. But you just can't neglect the regions. You can't neglect the other cities. The Prime Minister would argue that Christchurch, for example, has had a huge amount of money poured into it, not for its own fault, obviously, but the earthquakes. He talks about broadband and other things. And the other argument that John Key made today when he was asked that question was Aucklanders pay a proportionate share in rates and taxes. So actually, when you spread everything out, but he said when there are infrastructure needs, when there are projects, then sometimes the government just has to pony up.
Jane Patterson, our political editor, thank you very much indeed for ponying up in the studio. We appreciate it. Nice to see you, Jane, up here in Auckland. It's 6:15. We're going to talk about this batch and the owner of it on Lake Taylor. So he's a neighbour of the station there whose cattle have been in the water. He says he's complaining to authorities for the past decade about cattle polluting the lake. The land is majority owned by Chief Justice Sian Elias and her husband Hugh Fletcher. Edward Snowden says he, along with other batch owners, has complained to authorities, but nothing has been done.
The last decade where this occurrence has been happening quite regularly, I've seen the turf deteriorate, it's trampled. I've seen the river polluted with dead carcasses of animals which haven't made it through the winter. I've seen gorse now heavily introduced into the area. There's no way that gorse could have got in there in the upper reaches of that river, but it's been brought in by the cattle, and so now we're trying to chop the gorse out. It's ridiculous. What's it done? It's given the farm another few $100s. This is a very valuable area. It just makes me cry to look at it.
So that's Edward Snowden, who is a neighbour of the station whose cattle have been in the water. The Green Party says farmers who allow cattle to roam freely in waterways should be hit with steeper fines. We're joined now by Green Party co-leader James Shaw out of the Wellington newsroom. James, welcome to Checkpoint. Just before we go into the issue of cattle and water and protecting waterways, what is your take on the government's backing today so meaningfully of the City Rail link in Auckland?
Well, we're delighted. I mean, we've been campaigning very strongly for the City Rail link to start construction as soon as possible, and we're very pleased that the government's come to the party at last.
Why do you think they've come to the party at last?
Well, I have to agree with Jane Patterson. I think that National were the odd one out. I mean, we've been campaigning very hard for it, Labor have been campaigning, and the Council have. And so they were the odd one out. And I think that Auckland has really changed and people's expectations have changed. And as rail has become more of an option over the last few years, and as the roads have become more congested, more and more people want to switch to more efficient forms of transport.
Right, let's talk about cattle in the waterways, which is what you're here to talk about. Do you believe this is an isolated incident, or do you believe this is simply something that is relatively commonplace getting attention?
Well, I think that there are a lot of farmers who do the right thing by excluding cattle from waterways and riparian planting to stop nutrient runoff and so on. This is a very sad story because it is letting the side down. But I do know that in ECAN, about a year ago, there were up to 95 complaints made and only one infringement notice was awarded, and so you have to say that they're not really doing their job.
Have you spoken to ECAN? So 95 complaints, and is that in the calendar year?
Yeah, that was the 2013-14 year.
Okay, 95 complaints, one infringement notice. Have you spoken to ECAN? Do you have any understanding of why 94 were not upheld?
I haven't. No, I only got this information this afternoon.
Okay, well, we'll try and talk to ECAN about that. The issue is a balancing act here, isn't it? Because the farming, as you say, most farmers are doing the right thing. This is a powerful lobby group. We had Federated Farmers on the program yesterday, and they were reluctant to concede any fault here at all. So on the one hand, there is the economics of farming and the importance of that to this country. On the other hand, there is protecting the water. How do you get the balance right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, as I understand it, this farm actually had fencing in place, and the farmer actually opened the gate and allowed the cattle through because he was concerned that they were really hot. And of course, temperatures have been really high down there recently. But he shouldn't have to. I mean, if there were adequate troughs and trees for shade, then those animals should be comfortable enough already.
Okay, so what has to happen?
Well, I mean, the government could require that councils have a stronger regulatory framework in place, but I mean, as we know, protecting the environment isn't terribly high on this government's set of priorities.
Okay, so in meaningful terms, what would you like to see done?
Well, we would like the government to require councils to have much stronger regulation in place. We campaigned in the 2011 election on the idea of having in place a water users charge, and that money would then get spent helping farmers to put in place fencing and riparian planting. And we also think that they should heed the call of the Land and Water Forum for total exclusion of cattle from the waterways.
And how punitive does the regime have to be if farmers don't go along with it? What would you like to see happen in circumstances like these?
Yeah, personally, I think that prevention is way better than, sort of punitive damages and so on. But as I understand it, there's only a $750 fine in cases like this. And you have to say that when you've got a 5,000 hectare farm, that $750 is hardly any kind of incentive not to do it.
James Shaw, co-leader of the Green Party, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. Let's go to Whanganui now. Whanganui iwi say they've been finally able to treat human remains kept in storage for 100 years with the respect they deserve. Up to 80 ancestral remains, or koiwi, were returned to the tribe today to be buried. Te Manu Kōrihi reporter Lee Marama McLaughlin has more.
The kōiwi included ancestral bones, 3 skulls and other less identifiable remains, most of which had been stored at the Whanganui Regional Museum since as far back as 120 years ago. Whanganui iwi leader Gerard Albert was at the handing over ceremony this morning.
It was definitely an emotional ceremony. Not emotional in terms of a personal connection to any of the Waeua or Kōiwi, but really emotional because of the treatment of these remains over the past 100 years.
Not a lot is known about the kōiwi, but most of them trace back to the region. Mr Albert isn't happy they've been kept in storage for so long.
Our people had that opportunity to tangi for them and to deal with and process the way in which these remains have been handled, and then ensure that the appropriate tikanga, the appropriate rights recorded those remains, and then that they were interred in a place that was appropriate for them.
The kōiwi were taken to Aramoho Cemetery in several carton boxes where they were wrapped in harakeke or flax paper before being buried in plots donated by the council. The acting director of the Whanganui Regional Museum, Libby Sharp, says for the past 120-odd years, the museum has collected human remains, mostly those of Māori.
A lot of them have been, eroded out of cliffs or dunes. Some have been purposefully dug up during archaeological excavations, and dare I say it, some may have been picked up from graves when people were searching for grave goods.
The Māori co-leader of Te Papa National Museum, Arapata Hakiwai, attended the ceremony, handing over 3 skulls that had been kept in Wellington.
2 of them were adults and 1 was a child. These tipuna, the 2 of the adults are actually very, very old. They date to sort of the 1860s or before the 1860s. And the child, which we returned, was from the Wellington Dental School.
Te Papa has repatriated 104 ancestral remains to their places of origin. Ms Sharp agrees that storage is no place for kōiwi today.
Different times have different systems of belief. And, for the past 25, 30 years, the museum has actively not taken human remains. Many of them have been here for 100 or 50 years, a long, long time. It's appropriate and it's time that they were buried.
The Whanganui Regional Museum has a further 70 kōiwi to be returned to other iwi, and local iwi are pushing for it to happen quickly so they can be finally laid to rest. For Checkpoint, ko Lee Marama McLaughlin tēnei.
$6:23 is the time on Checkpoint. Coming up on World Watch at 6:30 World Watch PM with John Greaves. As preparations continue in Geneva for the start of the Syrian peace talks on Friday, humanitarian agencies are pleading for an end to the fighting so they can get aid in to help the millions of people in need. And the Malaysian Prime Minister is cleared of corruption after $681 million was transferred into his personal bank account. Extraordinary story that, coming up with John Greaves on World Watch at 6:30. The clock is ticking on humanity. And we might have just 3 minutes to go. The metaphorical doomsday clock was devised by scientists to measure the likelihood of a human-made apocalypse. It's reviewed each year, with scientists considering potential challenges to human existence like nuclear war, climate change, and so on. And the minutes to midnight show how close humanity is to a world-ending catastrophe. So how close to midnight is the minute hand now? Well, the ABC's Angela Lavoie-Pierre reports.
For the moment, the minute hand on the doomsday clock is staying put. Rachel Bronson is the executive director of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the group that made the call.
After serious discussions and consultations, the Science and Security Board has arrived at its conclusion, and it says, with utter dismay, that the clock remains at 3 minutes to midnight. It is remains the closest it has been over the last 20 years.
She says although the clock is a symbol, it's a serious one.
The clock is a metaphor for how close we are from destroying the planet. It is a summary view of leading experts deeply engaged in the existential challenges of our time. Each year, the Bulletin is able to generate a global conversation around nuclear security, climate change, existential threats, and other existential threats, and the role and responsibilities that citizens and leaders have in determining how safe or dangerous our world is.
If the relative stillness of the clock seems like good news, then think again. Lawrence Krauss is also from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists.
A year ago, the clock was moved forward to 3 minutes to midnight. At that time, the bulletin stated, "The clock ticks now at just 3 minutes to midnight because international leaders are failing to perform their most important duty, ensuring and preserving the health and vitality of human civilization." The decision not to move the hands of the doomsday clock in 2016 is not good news, but an expression of grave concern that the situation remains largely the same.
The decision is not made lightly. The clock has been maintained since 1947, informed by some of the best minds in the world, including 18 Nobel laureates. It reached its latest hour, 2 minutes to midnight, in 1953, prompted by American and Soviet nuclear tests. Things improved in the following decades, but then in 1995, the clock leapt forward again by 5 minutes when both India and Pakistan tested nuclear weapons, undoing the gains made at the end of the Cold War. Since then, the minute hand has been creeping closer to midnight, and despite the present pause, Lawrence Krauss is far from optimistic.
Developments have been mixed since we moved the clock forward a year ago. In spite of some positive news, in particular the Iran nuclear agreement and the Paris Climate Accord, nuclear tensions between the U.S. and Russia have grown. The situation in North Korea has become more acute. Tensions between Pakistan and India remain high, even as those countries increase their nuclear arsenals. And nuclear modernization programs in the U.S. and Russia violate the spirit, and I believe the letter, of the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
The director of the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, Sharon Squassoni, also cited government expenditure on nuclear weapons as a concern.
Nuclear modernization programs continue. China, Pakistan, India, and North Korea are all increasing their nuclear arsenals, making more weapons, albeit at different rates. And the U.S. and Russia, as Lawrence mentioned, are modernizing their arsenals. It is very hard to reduce your reliance on nuclear weapons when you expect to spend more than $350 billion modernizing them.
Thomas Pickering from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists says they're also keeping a close eye on Syria.
Whether negotiations in Syria will prosper or not is a long, demanding, and uncertain process that has really only just begun. So the nuclear arrangement is a step forward, a relatively bright spot in a difficult horizon, but not yet a kind of perfect, absolutely certain, always ready to succeed step ahead. And it is on the uncertainties as well as indeed the benefits that we based our decision.
Thomas Pickering from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, sending that report from the ABC's Angela Lavoie-Pierre. One of the reasons that the clock stayed at 3 minutes to and didn't get nearer midnight was the nuclear deal with Iran. Well, Pope Francis has met the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani at the Vatican, asking Tehran to help promote peace in the region. Here's Nathan Frandino from Reuters.
The leader of the Catholic world meets the leader of 77 million Muslims. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and Pope Francis shook hands for the first time at the Vatican Tuesday, amid a wider easing of relations between Tehran and the West. The Vatican says Francis called on Rouhani to promote peace in the Middle East and to help stop the spread of violence and arms trafficking in the region. Many Western countries accuse Iran of funding militant groups that they consider terrorist organizations. At the end of their 40-minute meeting, the two world leaders exchanged gifts, a Persian rug from Rouhani to the Pope with a commemorative medal given in return. The Vatican visit was one stop during Rouhani's first European trip, seen as a diplomatic tour to rebuild Iran's ties with the West after last year's nuclear deal and the subsequent lifting of sanctions.
And that ends Checkpoint for tonight. Thank you for listening and for watching. If you were, time for World Watch.
You're listening to RNZ National, where it's 6:30. Welcome to 1am. I'm John Greaves. Tonight, a controversial law in Denmark draws criticism. We visit a neighbouring country where 90% of the population's overweight or obese. A call to ban gay students from Indonesian universities, and a potential battle of the tycoons in American politics. Those stories and more in World Watch PM. But let's begin tonight in Denmark, where MPs have adopted a controversial plan aimed at deterring asylum seekers. The laws include measures such as the confiscation of cash and valuables from refugees so they can share the costs of integration, although items of special emotional importance will be exempt. The rules have brought up sharp criticism, with the United Nations saying that refugees deserve compassion. The ABC's Europe correspondent Anne Barker reports.
Critics call it the jewellery bill and say it smacks of Nazi-era treatment of the Jews. Denmark's parliament has passed a law to confiscate the valuables of refugees seeking asylum. Asylum seekers can keep assets worth up to 10,000 Danish kroner, about $2,000, but the rest would be taken to pay for their settlement in Denmark. Refugee groups themselves say the measures are wrong and dehumanising. I took with me my house keys, a mobile, my family's pictures and about $30, says one man. The decision comes in the context of punishing refugees currently in Denmark, says another. But a Danish government spokesman, Marcus Knuth, says the laws simply bring refugees into line with the rules for all Danes before they can claim social welfare. And he says the criticism is unfair.
We're simply asking that if asylum seekers, in the rare case where they do come with enough means to pay for themselves, then following exactly the same rules as for Danish citizens wishing to be on unemployment benefits, if you can pay for yourself, well, then you should pay for yourself before the Danish welfare system does it.
In reality, it's doubtful many refugees would arrive in Europe with the money or assets to be confiscated. But Adrian Edwards from the United Nations Refugee Agency says the new law sends a damaging message.
It runs the risk of fueling sentiments of fear and discrimination rather than promoting solidarity with people in need of protection. On the limited access to family reunification, we just remind people of the point that family unity is a fundamental principle in international law.
Denmark isn't the only country to confiscate refugee assets. Switzerland has begun taking valuables worth more than 1,000 Swiss francs, and several German states take even more, although both countries have taken vastly more refugees than Denmark. But the Danish measures are the latest sign that the compassion shown by many European countries towards refugees has its limits, and there are others.
We just need better enforcement on the ground.
European leaders this week are discussing plans to suspend the Open Borders Agreement, a key pillar of European unity, which allows passport-free travel across 28 countries. Member nations would be allowed to reintroduce border checks to cope with the migration crisis, something many have already done. Malta's Minister of European Parliament is Roberta Metsola.
Our citizens have a right to feel safe in all countries and all cities across the European Union. And if that means that we will need to keep stock of who is crossing our borders for a specific amount of time, then we will have to do it. However, we have to be very careful not to fall into the trap of thinking that every person who is coming into our country is automatically a terrorist, is automatically a criminal. That does not, in my opinion, mean that we should get rid of Schengen altogether.
Even a temporary suspension of the open borders policy has raised speculation that the so-called Schengen Agreement will eventually collapse.
Anne Barker. Denmark's not alone in its political struggles surrounding Europe's migration crisis. Tensions are growing within the German government over its migration policy. The Christian Social Union, the Bavarian sister party to Angela Merkel's Christian Democratic Union, has now spelled out its demands. The CSU's leader, Horst Seehofer, wants law and order improvements and no more than 200,000 refugees in Germany per year. And in what sounds like an ultimatum, the party says it even prepared to take the matter to court. Fabian van der Mark reports from Berlin.
Smiles and handshakes among Germany's conservatives in the Bundestag, despite deep differences over refugee policies. First, dozens of members of Chancellor Angela Merkel's own Christian Democrats submitted a written critique